Judges 1 through 3. This book basically answers the question, what happened to Israel between the death of Joshua and the coming of David? It's going to be a period of about 300 years. Some famous stories like Samson and Jephthah and Gideon are in this book, but also some heavy information, because this will be a dark time, realizing what happened to the nation between, again, the death of Joshua and the coming of David. What would Israel be like before it had a king? Well, the answer is almost part of that question, because we know there are tribes. How do tribes act? Well, they act tribally. That can be a good thing, love of family and traditions and so forth, but it can be a very problematic time, because you can have petty jealousies and arguments and even blood feuds that last for centuries. And that's exactly what will happen in the book of Judges. So as there are going to be local problems, because remember, Joshua did not drive out all the Canaanites. Whenever there's a local military problem, you're going to have a local military solution. And when these tribes are very disjointed and there's no taxation that draws them together, there's no central administration, there's no standing army, that's going to be then the challenge of this period, is to find those local chieftains within the tribes. And by the way, that's what a shofet was. We call them judges in our English versions, but more likely we could call them rulers or local chieftains, who arise because of a need and save. The word salvation or deliver is used many times of them. They save the people of Israel from a local problem. That's the basic storyline of Judges. There will be 12 different individuals, 11 men and 1 woman, who are called judges, or their stories are included in this book. 3 of them in our early chapters here. But let's introduce the story at this point by using these 3 passages in our opening reading. In 119, we learn, kind of just as a by the way, kind of remember where we are, that when it comes time to diagram or chart out how Israel actually occupies the land, it's much less than God had promised. That's basically because Israel didn't trust Yahweh. And also, practically speaking, the city-states that were there, the Canaanites, were very good at military prowess, and they had iron-enhanced chariots and such. So Israel was kind of limited, well, very limited to what they could control. It says in 119 that they controlled the highlands. And what I've circled here on the western side of the Jordan is a very hilly area. So they were able to control the hills. Basically, that's where they settled. 3:1-6 tells us that other nations, especially the Philistines, they're going to be living out here on the coast. And they're able to then really control this area. They don't get into the hill country as easily. There will be some east-west valleys that they will constantly use to get up into Israel and cause trouble. So we'll see this kind of geography or topography make a big difference as we watch the stories of the Judges unfold. The most important passage, though, that introduces the book of Judges is in 2, verses 10-13. Where it describes very carefully, painstakingly, that what happened after the death of Joshua almost immediately is that the people forgot Yahweh. Well, forgot is probably the wrong way to say it, because what happens is they begin, and the name Baal is used. We've mentioned Baal before, but just to remind ourselves how he figures into the story, he is the most commonly worshipped deity in Canaan at this point. It's not because he's the head of the pantheon in Canaanite thought, but he's the most enjoyable god to worship. He's the god of fertility, the god of sexuality. So there will be a lot of deviant kind of practices associated with the worship of Baal as we continue the story of Israel. But he's mentioned 500 times outside of the Bible, even at this time period. So he's a very popular deity. But as Israel forgets Yahweh, or dispenses it with their worship of Yahweh, and goes after a foreign deity, you could, by the way, you might as well forget the books that we've just studied, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. These laws, Torah in general, is going to be pushed to the wayside, because they're following a different deity. So it's easy to think that Israel was, to some degree doing everything they were supposed to do. I would say this would be a 300-year period of basically leaving the ritualistic system of the Old Testament behind and running hard after the deity of Canaan. We end chapter 3 by mentioning 3 judges. Othniel, he's the younger brother of Caleb, so he was probably a Yahwist, and he saves Israel from a local problem and at the beginning of chapter 3. A man by the name of Ehud is mentioned in 3 as well. He's a Benjaminite, and he lives there, therefore, somewhere here. He saves Israel in the city of Jericho. Remember Jericho, the fort there was being controlled by Eglon, king of Moab. Moab is down here. Eglon came up and took this fort and controlled it for some 18 years, which really controls the east-west movement of Israel, or puts Israel in a position of being attacked from the east. And so Ehud, through a ruse, assassinates King Eglon, and you can read about that in chapter 3. One more man is mentioned at the end of 3 in just one verse. His name is Shamgar. Interesting name. It's not even a Jewish name. His father's name is Anat, A-N-A-T-H, which that's the actual name of a Canaanite deity. She is a consort of Baal, so clearly this is not a Jew. This is not an Israelite. And yet he's mentioned at the conclusion of chapter 3 as one of those that God raises up to defend Israel. So our story almost includes, I guess you could say, a mercenary figure that God can, on his own time and through his own will, he can save Israel through the hand of a foreigner.